Okay, so now we've agreed that studying decisions in real life contexts might be a good way to find out what people will do, what they will actually do. But you remember that initially I also asked you, or like I showed to you the question from the Moral Foundations questionnaire that said, to what degree do you take into consideration the emotional suffering of others when you try to decide what's morally right? And this actually asks rather, instead of asking about the outcome, a behavioral outcome, this asks about a cognition. This asks, what is your process of making a moral decision? What is your cognitive process of figuring it out? Which pieces of information do you take into account and to what degree? So what about, how can we measure these processes well? So both on sort of the content side, like which pieces of information are integrated into people's decision, and also on the side of like how difficult is it for them to make the choice, or like how certain are they? How easy is it? Is this a natural thing to do, or do they actually have to work hard to make this decision? So that's what I mean by cognitive processes. And I want to now launch a little bit into some, again, measurement questions of how we can assess what processes are going on while people make decisions that have something to do with being pro-social or moral. And the first thing that we could do in order to study cognitive processes is in this realm is to look at decision times. So while our participants make their choices, we can take a look at how long it takes them to arrive at the final decision. So we would just present our decision scenarios, either the hypothetical ones or the incentivized decision scenarios, and then ask people to make a choice and simply track how long it takes them to make that choice. Now there's some evidence, for instance, that deontological decisions are faster than utilitarian decisions. We will talk more about this in the other session when we talk about theory. And there's also some evidence that pro-social decisions are faster than selfish decisions. And again, we will talk more about this in the other session. There's also contrasting evidence, just to point that out. So we might say that if one decision is faster than the other, then perhaps that's actually the easier decision, right? It's the decision that comes more natural to me. I don't have to elaborate so much on it, and I just make it like that. But it's actually problematic to infer how easy or like whether it's deliberate or intuitive a decision is depending on decision times because of what's called the reverse inference problem. So it is not necessarily true that fast decisions are intuitive. It might be. So there is some evidence that intuitive decisions are actually faster, and at the same time, we have the problem though that other processes affecting response times could occur simultaneously. So for instance, it might not be only decision like deliberateness, it might also be decision difficulty that acts on response time. So whether or not I'm fast at responding to a problem doesn't necessarily have to do with only whether it's like my innate choice to make, and but it might also have to do with just this problem being particularly easy, so that it's actually easy for me to make a decision on it. So decision times are interesting, but we have to be careful with what we will try to infer from them. So saying something is faster than the other, easy, but then making a step further and saying because it's faster, it is the intuitive or it is the deliberate decision, actually the intuitive, of course, then that's a more like shaky conclusion, and then there might be alternative explanations for that. So instead of only sort of measuring decision times, what else could we do? We could try to influence cognitive processes by, for instance, manipulating time pressure. So asking our participants to make a choice in the dictator game within 5 seconds, or answer this question of the dictator game only after thinking for at least 5 seconds. So having time pressure versus time delay. And we could also do this with a cognitive load manipulation. We could, for instance, ask our participants to memorize an 8-digit number or memorize a 1-digit number, and then create different kinds of mental load, leaving different amounts of mental capacity for other processes that are going on. So then we could sort of try to knock out deliberateness and see if that affects the choices that people will make. We could also bring the big guns and use neuroscientific methods to try to study cognitive processes. And this is something where I'm mostly out of my water because I'm not a neuroscientist. But I'm going to try to give you an overview of some of the research that's been done in prosocial and moral decision making, where again the details aren't really necessary for the exam of the people at Tilburg University, but I think it goes to give us some more stuff to talk about prosociality and morality. And for instance, there's some research that brain regions associated with abstract reasoning and cognitive control are activated more during utilitarian judgments, so the judgment that you would rather, in our trolley dilemma, maximize the number of survivors rather than not harm actively anyone by redirecting the train. There's also some evidence that damage to the prefrontal cortex increases utilitarian judgments, and again, this is an area that has to do with reasoning. Impaired brain regions associated with emotional responses, however, also lead to higher utilitarian responses. If we use transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, to disrupt a part of the brain, in particular the right tempoparietal junction, then actually we can see that the role of inferred beliefs and intentions of the actor in assessing whether a choice is right or wrong is reduced. And another thing that one could do if one was to employ neuroscientific methods would be to use medication that acts on neurotransmitters, for instance, SSRIs, and treatment with these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors actually increase prosocial responses by enhancing harm aversion. So that's just some stylized evidence suggesting that we can just try to study the brain to find something about cognitive processes, in particular, whether they're like one decision is more kind of intuitive than the other. And this can give us some indication, but again, it falls prey to the reverse inference problem, except if there is an actual manipulation going on. I also want to talk a little bit about process tracing because I'm pretty, let's say, enthusiastic about it. And the idea here is that we can try to make the process of making the choice visible by tracing it over time while it occurs naturally in the decision maker. And kind of the early idea here was the Think Aloud protocols, where basically participants are asked to just verbalize their thoughts while completing a decision task. So imagine I give you the trolley dilemma and I just ask you to narrate whatever's going on through your brain at that moment, so that I can later try to figure out if there are differences in what's going on in people's minds if they make the utilitarian or the deontological decision. Of course, there are also, the problem with this is that you kind of disrupt yourself all the time by having to verbalize your thoughts. So another way of doing this is by using information boards, where basically participants are shown a board with different pieces of information that are covered, and they can uncover them stepwise and then also go back to information that they had uncovered before, and we can find out kind of the order of importance for these pieces of information and what transitions are interesting for people, so which pieces of information are compared. And these real-life boards, like a cardboard with different pieces of information on it, covered by, let's say, sticky notes. There's, of course, a more modern version of this called Mouse Lab, where you could just do this on a computer. So you have a computer screen, and if you hover with your mouse over or click on a specific field, then information will reveal itself. We can also use the mouse for a different thing called mouse tracking. And here the idea is to trace the curvature of mouse movements. And I want to go a tiny little bit into detail about this. So if we take a look at this as an example of how mouse tracking could actually be utilized for research on prosocial decision making. So in this study, we have actually a prisoner's dilemma. So remember from in the beginning, we talked about the setup of a prisoner's dilemma. This is one. And in this case, participants are asked to choose option A or B. And they're asked to choose that by moving with their mouse from a central location on the screen in the middle, in the bottom, moving their mouse either to option A or to option B. Now, from the curvature of the mouse, or so goes the idea, we can read how attractive the other option was. So if I make a big circle towards A but then end up with B, actually then maybe I had a big struggle going on. But if I go pretty straight from the starting position to the stuff that I chose in the end, this seems like it would have been a decision where I had less conflict basically between the two options. That is the assumption here. So now we can take a look at the curvature of the mouse, conditioned on whether people made a cooperative choice or a choice to defect, right? And this is exactly what was done in this study. So now instead of looking at the curvatures in both directions, they're collapsed onto one so we can more easily compare them. And you can see people's kind of starting position in the bottom of the screen, and then they move to the option. And like I said, the sides are now collapsed onto the same side. And what do we see here? We see literally the X and Y coordinates of the mouse movement. So this is literally averaged, of course, across several participants and multiple trials, how people move their mouse between the starting position and the end button that indicated their choice. And we see two lines, one of them for cooperative choices and the other for defective choices. And what do we see? The choice to cooperate had the straighter line. So this would suggest that actually defection decisions here entail more conflict than cooperation decisions. And that would be a way of assessing how difficult or complicated it is for people to reach that choice. Finally, I want to introduce you to yet another process tracing tool that we can use to unlock what's going on in people's minds in real time, and this is eye tracking. So eye tracking relies on the eye-mind hypothesis, which is that there's actually, where the mind goes, at some point the eyes will follow. So, or the other way around, you could say that what is fixated will ultimately be processed. So if I take a look at your outcomes, I will ultimately be thinking about them. So there's some evidence that this is actually the case, or that it's interesting to use eye tracking. For instance, we see that people fixate more on information that has high utility, or that is important to the decision maker, and we can also see that people tend to fixate more on the alternative that they will later choose. So if I ask you whether you want a muffin or an apple, and I see you're looking back and forth between them, and then you end up looking at the muffin before you make a choice, this is the point where I can predict that you will choose the muffin. So the last fixation before deciding is more likely to be directed at the later chosen alternative. Now we can also utilize eye tracking to try to understand better the processes that are involved in prosocial and in moral decision making. And I want to show you here an example for a study that looked at cognitive processes in actually prosocial decision making. So what you can see here is basically a variant of the dictator game. This was the one where you have 10 euros and you can choose to give it to another person, parts of it, or to keep it to yourself. And here, this is a so-called decomposed dictator game, where we make that choice a bit different by saying, okay, there are two options. Still, you get to choose, and the other person just earns the money, like as a recipient. But instead of saying, okay, here are 10 bucks and choose any amount you want, this is simplified, and here it's you choosing between two options, A and B. One of them where option A, you earn €3.60, the other person gets €2.50. Or option B, you get €3.10, which means you give up a little bit, but the other person now also gets €3.10. So this would be the pro-social choice. This would be you giving up a little bit of money so the other person can earn more. Right? The selfish choice would be option A, to say I want to earn the most amount of money possible, and I don't mind if the other person has to earn a little bit less. So if we took this as a paradigm, we could study here how much people pay attention to the different pieces of information that are available. Like how much information do they allocate, how much attention do they allocate to what they earn themselves or to what the other person earns? And then does that predict whether they will make the choice to be pro-social or selfish? And the answer is yes, it does. So we can see that people who are more pro-social are indeed more interested about the outcomes of others than people who are more selfish. And finally, an example for using eye tracking in moral scenarios. So this is one from my dissertation, where in this case, this was a hypothetical dilemma, where basically trolley-type dilemmas were read out to participants. They listened to the dilemma situation, and then we showed them a decision screen that sort of captured the information available in the dilemma. And we just basically, we tried to take the pieces of information that were relevant and sort of categorize them. So who's the victim in this case? What action is involved? And what is the result of these actions? And then the idea was that, again, we could see people with different moral preferences, whether they would have different fixation patterns across this screen. So we did this in this hypothetical case, but we also ran a study with a non-hypothetical moral good. So this would be an incentivized decision where at stake were operations for cataracts. So that's a clouding of the lens of the eye. And this also basically captured the setup of a trolley dilemma, where there was a deontological option and a utilitarian decision. The details here don't matter much for this case. But in any case, so this was a bit more like cleaner decision screen, where again we could look at which pieces of information our participants were actually interested in before they made their choice, and how many pieces of information they would visit before they made their choice, and whether, like I said, there were any biases in depending on their moral preferences, which there were, but the details here are not relevant for you. So all in all, I just want to conclude this by saying, again, what we've done here in this session. So this session was asking, how do we measure whether people are pro-social or moral? And we've taken a look through a bunch of different ways to do this. We've started with global self-reports, and we've discussed problems with this approach. We've then moved on to studying decision behavior, and said, well, one way to go is to just study hypothetical decisions. And we've discussed problems with this approach. Another way to go would be to study incentivized decisions that might have some advantages, but it also has some problems. And then finally, we talked about processes, cognitive processes, and how we can study those. I've just shown you a couple of examples for how we can study what is going on through people's minds as they make up their mind whether they want to be pro-social or if they want to be moral, or rather not, or like what they consider moral. So the guiding sort of idea here was to ask, well, what are we even measuring, and is this the truth, or is this like, does it capture the essence of the thing that we want to measure? And so the takeaway for you from this session is that it's difficult for research in prosociality and morality to really capture exactly the essence of what we're looking for. And that's not just the case in prosociality and morality, of course, but we've exemplified this here. And I think I've given you a couple of discussion points on what might be tricky with the way that we try to measure the behavior and the cognitions also that are going on while people try to make decisions about prosociality and morality. So this is really the key takeaway, that it's a complicated thing to study, and we keep making progress in improving measures and improving our paradigms. But in any case, it's an interesting area of research. And in the next session, we will look in more detail at theories that revolve around the question of prosociality and morality. That's it for now. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next session.